Honestly, this thing is so small. It has been a long time since I have found any piece of audio gear that I've wanted to purchase at my local thrift store. But I finally found a receiver. And to be honest with you, I almost overlooked it, assuming it was an alarm clock. That little receiver was this Optimus STA-20. This was originally released in 1991. Now, I paid $13 for this unit, and I'm going to be honest with you, I've been listening to this more the last few weeks than I have my brand new Sony receiver or even the IEMA T9 Pro. Now, before we can plug this up and listen to it, I really need to take it outside and get it good and clean because it's covered in dust on the top, probably from sitting in storage for years, and then who knows how long it was at the thrift store. So I'm going to take this outside. We're going to get the controls deoxit. That way it's going to sound the best way possible. Then I'm going to show you a little bit more about the features on the front of this little unit because it has a lot of options. Show you the rear, and lastly, we'll talk about how much this little receiver has surprised me with the way it sounds. Okay, so the top of this is pretty dusty. Not sure how well you can see that or not, but pretty gross. So I'm gonna go ahead and clean that off and then pop the top off and clean the insides because I figure if there's that much dust sitting on side, there must be a bunch inside. There's the price sticker right there, 13 bucks. All right, let me get into it. So here's a look at the inside. Let's see there if I can get it in. That's not too bad actually, not too dusty. Looks like I can get to a few of the pots there, so I'm gonna squeeze those with deoxit and get those cleaned out. No idea what this sticker is, so I'm gonna try to take it off. Sweet. This volume button is pretty tight. Hopefully that deoxit will loosen it up a little bit. There it goes. That's much better. All right, well, I got the top off. I got pretty much everything cleaned out. It wasn't near as dusty inside as I thought it might be based on how dusty the top was. But if you're interested in getting sort of a overview of what this looks like inside, here you go. Luckily, 2 screws popped the top off, and I was able to get to the volume pot, balance knob, loudness switch, and tone control over there. So I was able to get those cleaned out pretty easily, which was good, because on the bottom of this, there's like, 6 to 8 screws. All right, I'm gonna put it all back together now. Now that we have this little receiver cleaned up, let's power it on so I can show you some of the features here on the front. Then I'll turn it around and show you some of the features on the rear as well. It's worth noting that this model, I believe, was released in 1991 from all of the information that I can find online. And it says that it is a 5-watt amplifier into 8 ohms. So not a lot of power, but I'll talk about that a little bit later in regards to how it sounds. Here on the front, you're going to see that there is a headphone jack if you want to connect a pair of headphones. There is a CD/tape input here, which actually you could probably use to connect a music streamer or an iPod or something along those lines if you still use a digital player of that nature. It's worth noting if you use this input here, it defeats this CD tape input that you would connect on the rear. So if you've got both of those connected and this isn't working, you need to remove the connection here in order to get sound. Now you've got a tone control knob here. It's just one knob and it basically says low and high. So you go low for bass, high for treble. I'll talk a little bit more about this tone control in regards to how it helps or doesn't help the sound when I talk a little bit more about how the overall unit sounds. So you've got the balance knob here, left or right. You've got a loudness button, which the manual suggests should be engaged in small listening rooms. Obviously your volume knob. Here's your tuning knob. I think that's one of the things that surprised me the most on this little receiver is that not only are you getting several inputs, but you can also still tune in AM and FM. Now, it tuned in fairly well. I did go ahead and hook up a FM antenna to this, and it did help bring in stations a little bit better. I also get crummy service in my house, so but great FM tuner if that's something you're interested in. So obviously here on your you've got your inputs listed over here: AM, FM auto, phono, CD tape. This was the other thing that I found really surprising was a phono input. Now, again, this came out in 1991, so I guess that was still pretty relevant at the time. But I mean, it's hard to argue with a great little amplifier like this that still comes with a phono input. And then lastly, you've got this CD and tape input, which is CD/tape, so it's one input for both of those. All right, that's everything for the front. I'm going to turn it around and show you the back. In the rear of the unit, if you start over here on the left side, you'll see there's a tape out RCA output, which means that you could connect a cassette deck to this, or I guess a reel-to-reel player too, and record anything that you'd be playing through this unit. You've also got your inputs here that I pointed out on the front. Tape, which it's only labeled tape back here, but you could also hook up a CD player, really anything with an RCA input that's not a turntable, because, like I said on the front, it's got a built-in phono input stage here. Now, the only thing that's kind of annoying with this is that you've got your RCA inputs here for the phono stage, but your ground connection is way over here, which kind of on vintage turntables, they don't give you a lot of room. So it's a bit of a stretch, but actually I don't listen to the radio much, and I was able just to ground it here to these, really any of these worked. So as you'll notice also, you've got an AM antenna here, your FM antenna connections, and like I said, the phono ground. Now back here you'll see this EQ switch, and you can turn this off or on. Now when I was using the regular bookshelf speakers, the manual suggested that I use this off. Now these units were actually sold to pair with Minimus 7 realistic speakers, and the manual says when you're using those speakers that you should consider clicking this EQ switch on because it will help fill out the sound. I'll talk a little bit about how that impacted the sound when using my Minimus 7 speakers a little bit later. And then lastly, you'll see over here where you can connect your set of speakers. The manual suggests not hooking up any speakers lower than 8 ohms. In regards to how the STA-20 sounds, it's worth noting that there's really two ways you can set up and use this receiver. The first way is just with traditional bookshelf speakers. But the second way, and something I didn't quite notice until I got this unit home and looked up on the manual, what best bookshelf speakers would pair to it, you can also, this was released specifically to be paired with Realistic Minimus 7 speakers, bookshelf speakers. Now, we all know that bookshelf speakers is kind of a stretch, right? These are much smaller than your average bookshelf speakers. It's funny, I bought a lot of gear a few years ago, and these were included in there, and I very rarely use them, although I know people like these sort of have a cult following online. And as I was reading through the manual on the STA-20 receiver after I bought it and read that about the pairing, I thought, wait a minute, I think I have a pair of those somewhere. So I went digging through my piles, and sure enough, there those were. And so it was great because I was able to pair those with this receiver. So when we're talking about the sound today, I'm going to actually first talk about how it sounded with the bookshelf speakers, and then we'll also talk about how it sounded with the Minimus 7s. Now, if you were to ask me what my initial thoughts would be as to how this receiver would sound, just looking at it before, as soon as I bought it, I would say probably not that great, right? Like, it's very small. In fact, when I set it on top of my CD Blu-ray player stack, you can see just really like how small it is. And also looking at the manual and seeing that it's rated at 5 watts, I really didn't think it would probably produce enough power to sound even decent. But I was actually pleasantly surprised. Now, first thing that's worth noting is the manual says it's 5 watts, which doesn't sound like a lot of power. But honestly, I barely turn this unit a quarter of the way up, and it's too loud, to be honest with you. I've yet to turn it all the way, like even halfway up, because even though it's 5 watts, this thing produces a lot of sound, and that's both through the bookshelf speakers and the Minimus 7s. Now, the Minimus 7s being smaller speakers, you can give it more power, but through both pairs of bookshelf speakers that I use this with, a quarter turn was more than enough volume. Now, the first set of speakers I hooked it up to were my Klipsch RPM 600 MK2, something along those lines. Basically, the updated 600 models that came out last year. And I was pleasantly surprised right out of the gate. I first put on Art Blakey's Roots and Herbs Tone Poet reissue from Blue Note on my turntable. So I was using the built-in phono preamp on this little receiver and really not expecting much. And again, was blown away by just how great jazz sounded. In fact, of all the genres I listened to, especially on the Klipsch bookshelf speakers, the jazz was my favorite on this little receiver. I also listened to Jackie McLean's It's Time, another Tone Poet reissue from Blue Note. And during the title track, there's a bass solo from Cecil McBee. And oftentimes, when you're using sort of like vintage, inexpensive looking gear at least, the bass can just kind of be one muddy note. There's not a lot of detail. But with this little receiver, I got all the detail I needed. All the instruments drop out on that song, and it's just Cecil playing bass. So there is a noticeable shift in volume when you're just miking the bass, but you could still hear it fine. And all of the notes had like the proper tones. It wasn't sort of like one just low end muddy sound. Now, while using the Klipsch bookshelf speakers, I did have some issues with sound. And it was mostly when using rock music or hip hop music, but that's not really across the board for everything. For instance, one album I really enjoyed through this receiver was John Prine's Bruised Orange. I wouldn't exactly call that a rock album, but it has sparse instrumentation, and everything sounded really great when listening to it through the STA-20. But where I started to encounter some issues was when I started using the CD and tape input and started playing CDs through my Sony Blu-ray player, which is fed through a Ship Modi DAC. While using the Klipsch speakers and listening to rock albums and rap albums or hip-hop albums, the bass distorted considerably, and I could not do anything. I was messing with the loudness button and the tone button, just couldn't get anything to really make it sound right. Great example of that was the album Phrenology by The Roots. I love that album and popped the CD in, and it just sounded bad from the get-go with the Klipsch speakers. Now, my original assumption was just that there was something messed up with this receiver, but I subbed in my Emotiva B2 Plus speakers, and with those speakers, the Roots album sounded great, as did every other genre. Jazz sounded great on there. I would give the loudness button a little boost with jazz. But there were the rock albums that I was experiencing distortion with on the clip speakers. I could engage the loudness button on here and not get distortion. Now, and the same with the Roots album. There are moments in there where it still gets a little heavy, and it's better to back off the loudness button because that's really forcing a lot more bass into your smaller room when that's engaged. But the Emotiva B2 Plus speakers handled this receiver wonderfully. It paired great, and that's what I've been listening to ever since when playing this receiver. That leads me to my next point, which is really this receiver is what I would call an active unit. And what I mean by that is nothing sounds perfect right out of the box. You're gonna wanna tweak some things, whether it's pressing the loudness button in and engaging it, pulling it out and letting the speakers breathe a little bit more, whether it's adjusting this tone knob. There's just something that will most likely need to be adjusted when you're going from album to album, and especially format to format. So if this is something that you're interested in purchasing or something that you have already in your collection, just be prepared to get some exercise in, getting up and down as you put new music on to really fine tune the sound to make sure you're getting the best performance possible. That also leads me to a tiny mini rant about pairing speakers and receivers. You just never know, no matter what you look at on a piece of paper, what's gonna sound great with the gear that you have. So don't get too caught up in reading the specs and then reading the specs on your receiver and just assuming it'll sound great. I really thought the clips would be great, and again, for jazz, they sounded awesome, but for other types of music, not so much. I listen to such a wide variety that I don't just want a pair of speakers that only sound great for jazz. Hooked up the B2 Plus speakers, which are considerably more affordable than the clips, and they sounded wonderful with this. So don't get too caught up in what it says on paper. Always be prepared to get a set of speakers in your house, pair it up with the gear you have, and just really listen and determine how it sounds from there. All of that is really just explaining how it sounded with bookshelf speakers. Let's talk next about how it paired with the recommended Realistic Minimus 7 speakers. I can't tell you how excited I was to realize that I actually had a pair of Minimus 7 speakers in my pile when I was reading through the manual for this receiver and saying that it was basically made to match those speakers. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe like Optimus, Realistic, those companies were owned by Radio Shack, which I think was also owned by Tandy Corporation. So all of these companies sort of went together, and I actually believe there may even be a model of this receiver with a different name. It may even be Realistic and a different model number. It's essentially the same receiver, but it was maybe marketed a little bit more for the Minimus 7s specifically. I'm not totally sure on that, but all those companies kind of blended together, and we're all releasing things that would match. And so I thought it was just great that I had these and was able to listen to that for this review. Now, the first thing that's very important to note is that when you're reading through the manual, it notes on the back of this receiver there is a EQ switch, and it just simply says on and off. And when you're using the Minimus 7 speakers, it suggests that you switch it to on. Now, I kept it in the off position when listening to bookshelf speakers, and that was my preference. But when I hooked up my Minimus 7s, I clicked it to on, and the manual was right. It did help fill in the sound, most notably with the bass. And I found that to be a lot more enjoyable than when having it in the off position. Keep in mind though, you've still got plenty of options here because you've got a loudness button on the front. And so it kind of goes back to what I was saying about this being a very active unit. Like when I was playing, I wanted to listen to Art Blakey's album again. And so I put it on my turntable, was listening through the built-in phono preamp with the Minimus 7s. And I found that with the EQ switch on, it still needed the loudness button to even add that much more punch and make it more enjoyable. However, when I was listening to the CD player, back to the Roots phrenology, if I had the EQ switch on and the loudness button engaged, I was getting too much bass and it sounded really poor. Once I backed off the loudness button, that CD performed well again. So like I said, you're gonna have to kind of get up and just press buttons and change the tones here to just get it to the way that you think it's gonna sound the best. As I mentioned earlier, my research showed that this was released in 1991. Now, another great thing was released in 1991, and that's obviously Nirvana's Nevermind. So I thought it'd be fun to bring out my CD copy, as I was really wanting to listen to as many CDs as possible through this and the Minimus, the Minimus 7 speakers, because honestly, like in 1991, I would have been listening to more CDs than records, and just hear how Nirvana sounded through it. With that CD, I found that the EQ switch being on was great, and again, the loudness button really kind of amped things up and made it sound like the really big rock record that it is. Granted, it's not an audiophile thing to listen to, but again, we're listening to a 5-watt receiver through bookshelf speakers that are about this big. So the audiophile needs went out the window a long time ago in this video. But I really enjoyed listening to the Nirvana CD through that. Didn't have any distortion or any issues with the Minimus 7s. And to be honest with you, I was really surprised at how much of a compact unit this could be. You could fit this in a workshop, in a garage, like really even your office. Like if you wanted a vintage setup, you could put all this together for, less than $200 probably, and have a really cool system that's going to give you a built-in phono preamp and just really, really enjoy the sound. One more thing that I noted when using the STA with the Minimus 7s, and that is because it's a compact unit, you're sort of tempted to want to put the speakers right next to the unit. Like you feel like it should all just kind of fit closely together. I found that that's when you would kind of start to get some odd sounds and some distortion. It was like everything was just too close. So once I got those speakers up off of the same listening surface as the receiver, and you'll have to excuse me because I did a quick test on this, so I'll show you here what this looks like. But I just simply raised the one speaker up and put it on my CD players, and I raised the other speaker up and put it up on my Vincent Phono preamp. Again, this was not for a long-term listening solution. I was just curious if it would sound even better when those speakers were elevated and separated a little bit from the receiver, and they did. They improved a lot. So if you're using this unit, try not to bunch it all up too much. Give those Minimus 7s a little bit of room to breathe, and I think it will sound even better. Even though it sounds like I'm going on and on about how great this receiver sounds, there is one thing that I found to be kind of annoying, and you really can't expect much when you're dealing with a unit of this size. But I found this tone control to really not be that great. I mean, it's only one knob, and honestly, I'm used to having two knobs, a bass knob and a treble knob. And that way you can adjust the bass the way you like it and the treble. This tone control just goes low to high. And when you go low, it just kind of sounds like you're in a tunnel, a bassy tunnel. And when you go high, it just sounds like really, really trebly. So I would prefer to be able to adjust both the bass and the treble individually. But again, on such a small unit, like there was probably just not a lot of room to fit both those options on there. It's a very minor complaint for a small unit that sounds the way it does, but worth pointing out. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I've been listening to this a lot more in the last few weeks than my recent purchase, which was a Sony STA-20. I think I totally screwed that up. STRDH190 receiver. And I bought that from Amazon for $140, I think, shipped. And also, I've been listening to it more than the IEMA T9 Pro, which was $160. So if you're looking for something that's kind of small and compact, you may want to consider picking up one of these off eBay for, I don't know, $45 to $60. Granted, you want to make sure it works right. But if it does, I mean, it's a great little purchase because you're getting a built-in phono preamp. For instance, the IEMA T9 Pro does not have a phono preamp. So if you want to hook up a turntable to it, you either have to have one with a built-in phono preamp on your turntable or buy an external phono preamp. Now, the Sony does have a built-in phono preamp, which is nice at that price. But if you're considering the IEMA T9, you may actually want to think about something like this instead. Now, the caveat with that is that you can stream Bluetooth directly to the IEMA, and this does not obviously have a Bluetooth option, given that it was released in 1991. But you could obviously buy like, you know, the Wii Mini Pro or something along those lines and connect it to this, and you've got a streaming unit. Now at that point, you're kind of getting to where you've spent the same amount of money if you had just got out and bought the IEMA T9 Pro. But if you have to buy an external phono preamp, you know, you're kind of, then you're probably still spending more money with the T9. Now with the Sony, you also get built-in Bluetooth and the phono preamp. So 140 bucks, like, you know, it's hard to beat that. But sound-wise, this really competes with both of those modern units. I found it to be a lot of fun to listen to, and I think you will too. Now, I just talked a little bit about how this compares with that Sony receiver. If you're interested in learning more about that budget Sony receiver, I actually did a review of that recently, and if you'd like to watch that and see if that's something you consider buying as well, you can do so by clicking on this video here.